Welcome to Obsessed. Today we have Kevin Henry with us. He is talking empathy. The tool of empathy is one that Brene Brown has inspired us to explore. Empathy is a tool of compassion. We can respond empathetically only if we're willing to be present to someone's pain. If you're not willing to be present to this pain, it's not real empathy. So, Kevin is an expert on empathy. As we explore this topic, explore and understand all the facets of empathy, get obsessed with Kevin Henry and get obsessed with living your best life. Welcome, Kev.
Thank you for having me. Nice to be here.
Wow, you've done so many things, and we were talking before we got started, and you're a host of a great podcast, All the Way Authentic. You're a
Mhm.
journalist. You do voiceover work for companies like Starbucks and Walmart and some of these other businesses. And you do so much more than that. You're like a Renaissance man.
Oh, that's
So,
nice.
yeah. And I'm really curious, and I'm sure the audience is too, on the tools of empathy.
And what he's
But
obsessed with.
What are you obsessed with, Kevin?
I'm obsessed with dieting right now, but that's a whole other
Oh,
interview.
talk to Tia. Tia, let's
Well,
help Kev.
we can talk later, but I mean, the COVID thing, what do they call it? The COVID pounds? I definitely have an issue with that in the last couple of years. So I'm trying to work on that. Empathy tools. So when you say tools, you mean just kind of how you go about actually empathizing with someone. So okay, well, I think one thing that strikes me about empathy, and I guess maybe there's a fear element in that. I think it's human beings. We don't like necessarily things like emotional pain, physical pain. I mean, any kind of emotional discomfort, things like that. So sometimes I've seen people, and even myself, maybe just want to get overly logical about a friend who comes to me and says, I have this problem. And instead of allowing that person to emotionally really pour out what they're feeling and for us to kind of go through the emotions together as a true friend should do, I think a lot of times in the past, I've gone immediately to problem solving. So that it's like, well, Jules, if you hate your job so much and you're being abused at work, let's go find you another job. Whereas what Jules really might want at that moment is for me to empathize and to share and kind of interact with some of her emotions. And so I think people that, um, you know, can be talked to in such a manner of like, well, just, hey, don't get emotional, don't cry over spilt milk, just go get another job. I think that person can be very dissatisfied, but I think it's coming from our fear sometimes of empathy because it makes us more vulnerable, and it might make us experience something in our past that's similar to what maybe Jules is going through at the same time. So it's that triggering effect of like, ugh, I just want to get away from this and just solve it real quick and not have to deal with it, if that makes sense. So I think being open to being vulnerable is one tool or is one key thing. Also, not being judgmental. We're all biased in our own way. So we might feel like, well, this is how I would deal with this problem, Mika. This is the way you should deal with it. Or you're getting too emotional. I'm being judgmental. I'm not allowing you to just be you.
I love that. I think that you're spot on when our human nature kind of kicks in and we want to fix it, right? We don't want to sit there with you in the problem and understand where you're coming from. We'd rather just throw solutions at you and move past it and find that comfortable zone of positivity and happiness. And in
Right.
reality, that draws a bigger distance between us. I think that empathy really does go side of inclusion. And I know that you have a background in diversity and inclusion, and especially in the workplace. How can we use empathy to get closer when it's not even just really personal relationship, it's professional relationships as well?
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to that judgmental thing. I mean, I think I've worked places where, for instance, they have a test called Strength Finders, where you take this test and then, you get kind of this printout of what your strengths are. And it's not so much what your weaknesses are, but there's things further down the list that you aren't necessarily, known for as strongly as certain other attributes. So some people are very good problem solvers. They don't like, they're not relationship people. They're all business. Let's deal with it. Let's do it. They keep emotion out of it. Some people, it's very important to have that everybody get along, that everybody have a relationship. Even in certain cultures, sometimes that relationship building is so important, as opposed to maybe the Western civilization in terms of how they approach things. So in my diversity work, for instance, I remember I worked for the city of Bellevue in Washington State for like 20 years. And sometimes we'd have these meetings and public forums. And in America, we have that kind of, do it your way, stand alone and climb the mountain, and that kind of thing. But in other cultures and in other age groups, you have people that maybe the whole family is involved in a major decision. Maybe there's a lot more interaction, and what does grandma think, and what does mom think, and what does dad thinks? Whereas in our culture, maybe it's more like, well, who cares what they think? It's what you think, you. So I think in the workplace, you have to be open to other ways of doing business, to other ways of communicating, to other ways of setting up a meeting, for instance, in terms of protocol and how that unfolds. Even the setting for the meeting. I remember one instance where I was working with a group of very well-heeled, upper class leaders in Bellevue, Washington, and they were talking about how they wanted to connect with diverse populations, and they kept inviting people to come to this really fancy hotel. And I said, some people, you got to go to someone's living room. Maybe somebody wants to meet you on the playground. Maybe somebody wants to meet you in the church. You've got to go to them. So you've got to push your own bias and your own lens that you look at people in the world through to the side, and then say, hey, just because I feel like dressing up and going to some swanky hotel to have a seminar is what I value, doesn't mean that other people don't value sitting down and having barbecue and beer. I once did a prostate cancer awareness seminar at a bar during happy hour, because I was told, if you want to talk to these men, you got to come they're at the pool room at 5:00. And the owner said, I'll put out the food and the beer and you can talk to them about cancer. And that was probably the most well-attended event I had, because I was willing to go, let's not go to a fancy meeting room. Let's go to a bar. And I had a great time. And they really appreciated the talk. So I hope that answers the question.
And that speaks to meeting people where they're at, and understanding their stories. And to Tia's point, I consider myself a very even an empathetic person. And in the culture of coaching, when you attach yourself to these energies and you don't know how to create those boundaries, that can be life-sucking, it can be draining. And what have you found as your best tool to kind of, make the division between your empathy and care for someone else and for yourself as well?
Well, one thing is to learn how to listen better. And that's hard for me too sometimes, because I'm one of those problem solver kind of people. But I think that doing exercises, even where I've actually sat in a meeting, and before I entered the meeting, I said, I am going to sit here and not say a single word. Because in the meeting, a lot of times I'm too busy thinking, I'm not really totally listening. I'm more interested in what I've got to say, and what the meeting really needs is my opinion. And it doesn't open me up for other viewpoints and for connections, because once people sense you're not listening to them really, or you're trying to rush them and things like that, they start to disengage, even on a subconscious level. So the elements of time, I mean, sometimes it's been so frustrating in the workplace. You go to a meeting and say, okay, we've got a full agenda and we've got 55 minutes to get through this. And so some people are more storytellers. Some people can just go to the meeting and say, okay, here's my PowerPoint, boom, 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 boom. Here's the website, goodbye. Other people, it's like they got to sit there, they got to feel comfortable, they want to tell you a story. And when I lived in Hawaii, they use the phrase talking story. That's how you build relationships. You don't just send people emails. You have to go down and sit down and maybe have, some Kahlua pork down at the barbecue place. And that's how you really uh, build empathy, and you build connections with people by just freeing yourself of these old values and these old ways of thinking, I think.
I love that. I think that makes a lot of sense too, because Jules, I also struggle with that, trying to separate myself from other people's emotions. And I notice that it's not helpful when I do take on those people's emotions. It's not coming from this place of understanding. And I was thinking about it after reading about empathy in Brene Brown's new book. And she really says how we need to dispel the myth that empathy is walking in someone else's shoes. Rather than walking in your shoes, I need to learn how to listen to the story you tell me about what it's like to be in your shoes
Mm.
and believe you even when it doesn't match my experience.
That is great. And one thing immediately I go back to is the diversity, equity, inclusion work that I am involved in. And very often, of course, the topic of racism comes up, for instance. So if you're living, and it's not that you have to be a white person necessarily, but if you're living in one environment and you have a certain lived experience, like let's just say you live in the suburbs in a very kind of mostly white environment, which is void of a lot of the things that people go through, say, in another city, that becomes kind of your reality. And then you start making assumptions about, well, my neighborhood, my community is like this must be the way it is other places. And if the cops pull you over, all you got to do is smile and say, hi, officer, what's up? And nothing bad will happen, because that's been your experience. But other people might have a completely different experience, and people have to be open to that. And what I tell people is, like, even if there's a part of you going, wow, I can't believe that story, listen to that story and then start to imagine what would it be like if you were pulled over and you, strictly because of your appearance, and were hassled, harassed, jailed, physically assaulted. Just start to imagine what that would be like, because for a lot of people that's never happened. Like as a kid, I was never bullied, but if I started to imagine what would it be like if every time I came to school, a bunch of people were calling me names as I walked to my class. People have to, and the other thing is that there's a lot of, you probably heard the term microaggressions that can happen, where people don't have to call you, I don't have to call you a name, Tia. There's other ways that I can show that, you're not my cup of tea, more subtler ways. And even like, I was in Montana about 6 months ago, and not a very diverse place from what I saw. But on the way to the airport, I saw the largest Confederate flag I've ever seen in my life. I mean, it wasn't a flag, it was basically a banner taking up one side of a building. So for me personally, as well as other people of color, especially Black people, we have a problem with the Confederate flag. So other people I've known who don't have that lived experience, maybe haven't studied history, will go, what's the big deal? It's just a flag. What's the big deal? It's part of our history. I said, well, suppose, somebody told me this one time. I said, suppose every time you went to the park, there was a statue of your abusive ex-husband, sitting there staring at you. Just a statue, but it represents something. So imagine, what I try to tell people to do is, and this is where the empathy comes in, is put yourself, just imagine what it would feel like if that happened to you. And I think you're headed in the right direction if you do that. Who's next? Did I answer the question? But tell me if I'm
You
not
did.
answering
I
the
thought
question.
Mika was next.
Well, you guys are
Mika's
like,
turn.
you need some dramatic music for those long pauses.
We'll have some dramatic music.
Dun.
But I think the fact that when you said, like, how would you like if there was a statue of your abusive ex-husband in the park staring at you? I mean, that brought it home to me. I don't have an abusive ex-husband, but
That's good.
That visualization is so powerful, and walking through those techniques in terms of those visual, to be able to feel it, to be able to visualize it, because some people can't even access their emotions, especially when someone seems so different than what we seem on the face. But we're all very, very similar. We're all humans. We're all walking the same path, the same journey. But some of us choose to extend our our ability to listen and understand while others don't. And
Well,
tell
and
me,
some of
why
that
is that, Kevin?
well, I think some of it too is how you're raised. If you're raised in a family where emotions, for instance, are freely expressed and people work through stuff together, or conversely, you're raised in a culture or a family where emotions are suppressed and not expressed freely. So that maybe becomes a norm for you. I mean, I kind of grew up with old school parents, and my dad was a lovely man, but he was from the military and he didn't express a lot of emotions. And if you did express any emotions, it was like, well, let's just fix the problem. Don't cry about it. So I kind of grew up with that logical thing, logic, fix it. And then, but some friends of mine, it's like every little thing, maybe in my mind that happened to someone, there had to be a big discussion about it. We got to talk about it. We got to have a big discussion. We got to go out to dinner and talk about it some more. And then sometimes there was never even a conclusion or a resolution. It was just like, we need to talk. And I've even had people tell me, I don't need a solution. I just need you to listen to me and understand and feel what I'm feeling on some level.
It takes an element of imagination to be able to do that too. We kind of have to get creative with connecting with people and using that visualization of what was it like for you to experience that. And I think that sometimes we get conditioned out of using our imagination, especially while growing up.
Well, and again, I think there's a natural, I mean, some people would call it denial or whatever, but I think there's a natural knee-jerk reaction sometimes to not want to believe something, because sometimes I do that. I mean, I work in social services, and sometimes I hear these stories about abused kids, for instance. I work for a mental health agency now, but in Hawaii, I worked for another one where we ran a shelter for domestic violence survivors. We had clinicians and therapists for children who had been abused. And I remember one in particular where the counselor, I mean, she didn't mention a name, but she said, yeah, my 12-year-old client just came in, and yeah, her dad made her pregnant again. And she just said it very matter of
Oh my
fact.
God, that's
And I
horrendous.
said, how can you do this job? She says, I just I have to detach on some level to be able to do that. So I think there's different degrees of empathy depending on your profession. Because if you're a cop, for instance, you can't get upset, even though you might empathize with the person you're arresting, but you can only let that go so far, because you're not going to let them. I feel so bad for you, Jules. I'm just going to let you go.
I hope they say that
Even
about
though,
me when I get
well, with
arrested.
Jules, you'd probably talk them out of it, but out of the arrest. But you know what I'm saying.
But that's why they say doctors have a bedside manner, because if they engage in every single illness and really took on that weight of what every patient is going through, they would literally wither up and die themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, or suppose you're a psychiatrist. Imagine sitting there 8 hours a day listening to horrific stories. But as a regular person not in that field, again, I think there's this tendency to go, well, I can't believe, because sometimes I'll say that I can't believe that anybody would like beat their 2-year-old, into a coma. But it's probably happening right now.
But to kind of flip it back to what you mentioned earlier, it's really great for someone who has, like, someone comes to you and you mentioned that they want you to feel them to some degree. They want you to feel them on some level.
Mm-hmm.
If someone is feeling miserable, fear, pain, worry, shame, anger, guilt, you know, of course, they don't want their friend to feel that same shame, guilt, fear, worry with them, but they want to feel connected. They want to feel like you can relate, you hear me. They want to feel heard. They want to feel seen. They want that empathy, that what they're going through right now, it matters to you.
Mhm.
So if no matter what the situation is, they just want to feel like what they're going through, it matters to a certain level. So it's great for whoever's listening to be able, how can that person be able to connect with them? I know that you mentioned um, some of the tools is being open to being vulnerable and not being judgmental, listening. You mentioned that, being present. What are some other tools to help that person so that they're not wanting to like get straight to the solution, but getting to a place with here's where you are right now, and your situation is important enough for me to listen to. Like I'm hearing you right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because sometimes I think, I mean, there's people in my life, for instance, that depending on what is happening, I'll go, will determine who I go to, I guess. There's certain people that I know, like I had one friend of mine who I would only tell him certain things because he was a true friend, but he would always agree with me all the time. So no matter, so because he was like, "You're right. That's awful. That's terrible." And I said, "Sometimes I don't need that. Sometimes I need to say, hey, maybe you need to think about how you contributed to that problem." And that actually was more nourishing for me than just somebody who always agrees with you. But one thing I would do with somebody is say, look, it's like when somebody dies, and I have told people I can't imagine what you're feeling right now, really. I mean, I've had people die, but you are you. So I can't say, well, I know exactly what you're feeling like right now, Tia, because that happened to me last year. Well, yeah, there's some similarities, but then again, you have your own unique experience. So what I really try to reiterate to people is like, I am here for whatever you need. I mean, I even remember when the Black Lives Matter protests were going, and there was all of this anger and protesting, and in some cases it was rioting, whatever. And there were people at my agency where I work who were Black people who said, I just don't want to talk right now. I'm just so upset about this. And so we would have these circle discussions, and so some of the people that wanted to be supportive of them say, look, I don't have that lived experience. I can relate to it on a certain level, but I want to support you. Let me know how I can do that. And so if somebody just wants, I've had people cry in front of me for 30 minutes, if that's what they want to do. Sometimes people just don't want to say anything. They just want somebody with them. We can go to a movie together. We're sitting on a couch. So I just tell people, be flexible, whatever, and be patient. Don't say, well, it should be, yeah, they died 2 weeks ago. You should be at this certain stage of your grief by now. I hope that kind of answers the question. I just think you have to be,
No, it
you have,
does.
you have to treat everybody as an individual.
Treating everyone as an individual. And it's to be very intentional as a human being, to be a support for them, as well as to be clear that you need to take care of yourself as well. And I mean, going to the Black Lives Matter, I remember when the whole George Floyd thing happened up in Minneapolis, where Tia's from. Um, Mika, as I was trying to understand it, because I always told myself, and this goes into a little bit of diversity of inclusion, but I always thought, and it's not necessarily right, because she educated me on this, and she was very patient with me, but I don't see color. Everybody is the
Mhm.
same and equal. And wow, did I get a schooling on white privilege. Not
Mm,
that Mika was at all like mean or derogatory. She just
mm.
educated me. And I literally had no idea. So that's kind of what I pulled from what you just said. Um, and I'm grateful for Mika for even putting up with me for this long.
Well, I think it's one of those. I mean, in my mind, saying that is kind of a fantasy because of just everything's happened in the last 400 years in this country. but it's kind of an ideal. I mean, it's kind of like, yeah, and there's a part of me that wishes that, it's just not that important. But the issue really for me sometimes is that a person's color, whatever it may be, their background is a significant part of who they are. So when you say, I don't see color, then you're not seeing my
Right.
history.
It's horrible.
You're not seeing what I go through on a daily basis. You're not seeing, it's like the tip of the iceberg. I use that in the training, that
It showed no
exercise.
empathy though. I mean, I thought I was showing empathy, but I thought it was like just a lover of all humans, but it's not fair to people who have had different experiences. So, you know,
Well, I mean, it's like even if you made it a gender thing, like suppose I said, well, I don't, Jules, I don't see you as a woman. So, so all of the things you've been through, the things you go through, because I don't even see that. It's just, I just see you as Jules. But
that
and the other thing is
that's a
that I
great
think
example.
the other thing I think is that it lets people off the hook, because in that way I don't have to, I don't really have to deal with any of the racism and the sexism and any of that stuff, because I just see people, but it's kind of ridiculous at the same time, because if, for a lot of people, I mean, we're still a minority in this country. And a lot of times when I've seen people say that, they're always the dominant culture, and they're always in an environment where they are the majority. So they might have their one black friend and their one gay friend and their one Asian friend, but they're always 90%, unless they get in their car and specifically drive somewhere or go to another country. It's just easy to say that. But what happens is, and some people call it blind spots, you get blind spots about things, and this translates into the workplace. Because I remember I went to, I don't know if I told the story before, but I used to go to a dentist here in the Seattle area. White dentist, the whole staff's white, great dentist, very nice people. Kept going to him. One day I noticed, I said, all the pictures on the wall, all the photos of the before after kinds of ads that people run, must have been 25 photos, all white people. And so I finally asked him, and I said one day, I said, suppose you went to a dentist's office, you mean, Joe Jones, Dr. Jones. We lost somebody. And everybody was black in the office. Would you feel a little bit out of place? And he said, yeah, you're right. I would feel like I didn't belong there. I said, well, look around and look at me. All
Cut it
right.
off because our Wi-Fi. But no, I mean, I think this is a really important conversation to have. Especially with we are February 1st is Black History Month. It is continual education, but I know it's a burden for Black men, Black women to feel like they have to educate us white people all the time, right? So I don't know.
Well, I mean, for me, I like talking about it most of the time, but it really depends on the attitude of the person I'm talking to. If somebody's just open to learning, I'll talk for hours sometimes. If I really feel like, hey, this person's just, because there's things that I don't know. I've never been to Africa, for it. So if I'm not going to make a bunch of ignorant statements about what it's like, and I would hope that they wouldn't feel like burdened. What I don't like is when somebody is insistent that they know something and they really don't. And instead of being open to it and empathetic, they just dig their heels in. Well, I saw this documentary. You saw a documentary, so you you didn't even leave your house, but yet you're going to tell me what it's like, what it's really like to live in South Philly or some country, because I saw a documentary and I read a book and saw a YouTube video. So now I know. That's what
Wow.
ticks me off.
Yeah. Well, I totally relate to you, Kevin. But you mentioned something, a key word, when someone is open, when they're open to listening, open to like listening and hearing another perspective, totally different from, the narrative that they've had since they were born, So um, I love this conversation, and I want to ask you, what are some of the final tips that you can give us, our audience? Like, what final message that you would like to translate to us?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is be curious. I'm a natural curious person. My wife would say I'm nosy, but I always say I was a journalism major,
Most
so I'm
men are
just,
nosy,
we're
ladies and
nosy,
gentlemen.
I'm just nosy. I'm like, why did that person do that? Where's that accent from that I just heard? So I think be curious, also allow yourself to be vulnerable, because so many of us, well, all of us really, we grow up with biases, we grow up with perspectives, we grow up based on our lived experience. I mean, I have to check myself all the time, especially I have like regional biases. If I'm in like downtown Seattle, my attitude's a lot different than if I'm in, rural Montana, because I'm expecting people to be more racist in Montana. And I remember one time I was in a Walgreens, and I'm looking around. I haven't seen any black people in 3 days, right? So I'm just waiting for some like old white racist man to come say something dumb to me, right? So I'm standing in line, and I see this white man, and he looks at me, and he points, and he starts coming toward me, and I'm like, okay, here it comes. What is he gonna say? And his finger goes down, and he says, Green Bay Packers, go Pack, go. I was wearing my Packers sweatshirt.
Oh, jeez.
And so he was pointing at the sweatshirt, and I wound up talking to the guy for like 15 minutes. Nice guy. But I had that stereotype in my head. If I hear country music, see pickups and gun racks, so I think that we have to be willing to look inward. So many people want to know, what do I do? Coach Jules is going through this. What should I do? I said, well, that's fine to think about what you want to do to be more empathetic, but you have to understand why it's important, why what you're doing is significant. Otherwise, you're doing things and you don't, it's like being a surgeon. You say, well, why are you operating like that? Well, I don't know. Somebody told me to do it that way. But you understand why you're doing that, and what, if you screw it up, you might kill the patient. So I think we really have to be willing to look at our warts and our biases. And I think that makes us more connective to people, because people value that. If you're willing to be vulnerable with somebody else, they'll value that, because you're letting down your defenses.
Well, I'm not going to let the Green Bay Packers thing just
I
fly
know
by
you're
me right
from
now.
the Bears. I know you're the Bears, and
Is that okay
Mika's
if I
the
have a
Dolphins.
bias against?
Mika's the Dolphins, or the what's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Sorry about yesterday, but my team lost too.
Mika and I are like, we don't know football. What are you talking about?
Oh, all right. Well,
She's a
never
Tom
mind.
Brady fan. She's got Tom Brady. But
Well,
when
Tom's
I
going to be
hear the
sitting on the
Packers,
couch with Aaron Rodgers.
I'd be walking up to you in that store and I'd be like, why are you wearing that Green Bay Packers
Well, that's another
shirt?
interview. That's another story.
But we love you, Kev. It's just so important to hear different points of view, Green Bay Packers or not. It's important to hear different points of view. And when we close ourselves off to different viewpoints and conversations, that's where all of this stems from, because we breed fear, we breed anxiety, we breed a culture of non acceptance. So, people like you, Kevin Henry, you are changing the narrative in dialogue, and we're grateful for you.
Well, thank you.